What I can remember the most about the rise and fall of Star Wars Battlefront was just how impactful and influential it was for me. From the joys of flying an X-Wing for the first time over the sands of Tatooine, to the annoyance and frustration of dealing with loot boxes and the insistent calls for microtransactions. From PlayStation to portable to PC and back, I don't think I've ever been on a more turbulent ride, nor one as nostalgic. I was new to Star Wars by the time I first laid eyes on Battlefront. I had just started seeing the original trilogy on DVD and the LEGO games on my DS. Things were a lot different back then. One could simply borrow a game from a local store for a pittance if they didn't have much money, instead of insistently refreshing Steam for a sale. I got into a lot of games I loved this way, from Madagascar to Star Wars Episode 3. And it was at my local Town and Country video where my sister found a Star Wars game I had yet to play. It adorned a stormtrooper with the tagline, "Live the battles," on the back. I remember not being entirely thrilled at the game's suggestion, but as I had nothing else to choose, I picked it up anyways. I was more used to the narrative-driven platformers popular at the time, so I couldn't imagine what kind of game that this might have been. But when I popped it into my PlayStation 2's disk drive and started up a campaign, well, it was like a whole new world was opened up for me. This wasn't a linear platformer where you had to go down a set path. Nah, Battlefront was completely open-ended. The map was your domain. You got to go anywhere, do anything, blast everything along the way. Battlefront was so much more than what I could have ever imagined it being, and I loved it. Sure, it had flaws. Galactic conquest was boring, and the campaign was a slog, outside of a few select mission-blasting Gungans. But instant action and split-screen multiplayer all but made up for it. The only issue I couldn't forgive from the original Battlefront was the fact that it made me want more of it, which I got not too long after, when we visited a nearby city that had an EB Games. My brother, who also enjoyed Battlefront at the time, found Battlefront 2 amongst its used titles. From what I can recall, he got it for a good price. Now, if you were ever looking for a textbook definition of a good sequel, this is your game. The core of the gameplay was barely touched, and in return, a slew of new gameplay modes and features were added to make the overall experience feel complete. Galactic Conquest was the major update. Now a long drawn-out board game where you faced off your opponent in the ground or in space. Space battles were also new to the series, a nuisance for some, but for me was the cherry on top of this delicious cake. Taking down capital ships and exploring them felt like a dream come true. Then there was the slew of new balance, tweaks, and shiny new toys added everywhere, which made the game feel as tight as a drum. As I grew more and more accustomed to this third-person shooter, I didn't realize how much was changed until I went back to the first Battlefront, and desperately wished that there was a sprint button, or the dodge roll wasn't mapped to the jump button. But I always loved both games. They each had their strengths, like how in Battlefront 1 you can fly a starfighter on the ground maps, while in Battlefront 2 they were locked up in space. So I always jumped between the two depending on which maps I wanted to play, or which type of clone trooper I wanted to play as. I was content with the content on offer, but there were a few improvements I wanted. A bit more customization here, and more maps there, but I could always wait for Battlefront 3. While the Star Wars Battlefront 3 was in the work, sadly the jump from the 6th generation of console to the 7th laid waste to a lot of good game studios, Pandemic being one of them, being acquired by EA and eventually shutting down in 2009. But I always still held hope that one day the game would eventually come out. But to me, the next game in the Battlefront series came to my attention when I was browsing the local Toys R Us when I saw a new portable game console with a familiar logo on the box. Up to that point, I had never heard of this portable PlayStation before, and yet here it was, with the next Star Wars Battlefront game as a pack-in bonus. You can bet my preteen ass that I begged and pleaded to get this thing, and with the promise of waiting to Christmas, I eventually did. My excitement was unquenchable, so much so that I was even getting practice for it in Battlefront 2 the night before. But it was on Christmas Day that I finally can play my shiny new PlayStation with my shiny new Battlefront. I personally would not call Star Wars Battlefront Renegade Squadron the next title in the mainline games, but I would definitely call it a damn good side game. Sure, we lost our Battlefield-esque classes, but in its place were customizations I could only dream of, where I could be a clone ARC trooper with a shotgun and a jetpack. The new maps were fun too, though returning maps were severely limited by the PSP's hardware and the game engine. Even space battles were a lot of fun. Sure, it was a bit more handholdy, but on such a tiny screen, I'll happily take the assist. Even the game's story was pretty good. Sure, it didn't touch the Clone Wars, but it went beyond the 6th movie, which was a luxury for me at the time. Over time, I would eventually add the PSP port of Star Wars Battlefront 2 to my game library, and got the first-hand taste on just how far behind a PSP was in terms of a PS2, especially with the removal of the main campaign and the loss of a lot of my favorite maps. But as Battlefront 3 entered development hell and Pandemic Studios inched closer to closure, the complementary games which were designed for it soon made their way into the wild. While the PSP port was clearly heavily based off the Star Wars Battlefront Renegade Squadron, it offered a more complete story mode and some unique maps that really made the game hold its own. But I lost too much in terms of feature to get the gimmick of ground the space to work on a PSP that I find it difficult to return to, at least in comparison to the more complete package that was Renegade Squadron. All in all, I liked the Battlefront PSP games, but they only could just keep up with the juggernaut that was Battlefront 2, which I did return to regularly. And with no Battlefront 3 in sight, I just waited and hoped that someone else would eventually pick up the Battlefront mantle. I didn't know how good I had it back then, with something, anything new, for not just the Star Wars Battlefront series, but for Star Wars as a whole. While I did enjoy the various side games the Star Wars license attached to it, LucasArts wasn't doing so hot, with many promised titles and sequels falling below expectations for consumers and sales. LucasArts soon eventually stopped making games altogether. So when Disney offered to buy out Lucasfilm, I was cautious, and should have been too. Especially when the now Disney-owned Lucasfilm and EA signed a 10-year exclusivity deal, which should have ushered a new renaissance of Star Wars video games, but instead only extended the drought. For years I waited for something to play, but when the only thing that came to offer was more incomplete Star Wars Lego games, I took a pass and waited until the movies were done, and TT can finally make the collection game that they wanted to. So I waited, and in 2015 when EA finally revealed what they were making after all these years, it turned out to be a brand new Battlefront for the latest systems. My hopes rose amongst everyone else, as EA's Battlefront didn't just look amazing, it looked polished too. And if the game was like any of EA's past Battlefield games, it was going to be a good time. And the beta made it seem like it was going to be too. But when the game came out, it wasn't. What we eventually got was an online-only mess. No story mode, no offline galactic campaign, and a bare-bones basic training mode. Flying a spaceship was more trouble than it was worth to even find the random icons on the map, and with a focus on exclusively the Galactic Civil War, it was a Clone Wars-shaped hole in my heart. I was just glad I waited to get the game on sale, especially since EA's Battlefront was slowly patched over its life to improve it. Basic features we used to get on launch were added back in, like the game's main mode, Walker Assault, was eventually playable offline. But if I'm honest, at this time, I was having more fun playing the PC version of the first Battlefront than I was trying to fight against the over-leveled guys online. Looking back, EA's Battlefront should have been a warning for what was to come. I silently wish I paid more attention to the weapon unlock and skin grinds, and the constant push to spend money on the in-game shop. But when the next Battlefront game was announced, and I saw both clone troopers and First Order troopers, I let my excitement get the better of me. I really did hope that this time it would be better. That this time it was going to have a story mode. And this time we were going to get a proper online and an improved online mode. That this time it was going to be good. But the sense of pride and accomplishment that I felt when I decided to wait a week before buying the game was just spectacular. And the proverbial beating that EA got when it was worked out that a player would take 40 real-world hours to unlock Darth Vader or spend an ungodly amount of money for loot crates was well justified. But unlike EA's Battlefront, I did get EA's Battlefront 2 when it first went on discount. And I will say that it was an improvement over the first game, not that it meant much. Starfighters, when available, were actually fun thanks in small part to Criterion working on it, and eventually making an entire game based on the mechanics. The game was much more balanced and the game modes were more enjoyable, with some narrative elements sprinkled into the Galactic and Starfighter Assault maps. Sure, blasters felt weaker and less fun, but I never felt this was as one-sided as the last game. For all intent and purpose, it felt like EA tried their damnedest to turn Star Wars Battlefront 2 into their next money printer. But when their beatings made its way into the news cycle, they gave up. And when they did, it felt like the devs were left all alone to fulfill its contractual obligations with Disney, and the real game finally emerged. And what resulted was a 4-year-long apology letter from the devs and EA's marketing team. With new game modes, an absolute removal of loot boxes, and the inclusion of more offline modes. Plus all the Clone Wars content a Star Wars nerd could ever dream of. Supremacy was something I had only expected to see out of a Star Wars Battlefront 3, while Ewok Hunt was absolutely terrified to play on your first night. But even then, while EA's Battlefront 2 was the best game which they could have possibly came out with corporate breathing down the developer's back, the game was sadly still flawed. Sure, the campaign wasn't too bad, but offline game modes are still limited, and most of the game's narrative is still locked to the online. And with a very limited amount of replayability, I find when I do wish to return and play the game again, I quickly put it down when the random map selection isn't the one I wanted to try. The saddest thing about EA's exclusivity to the Star Wars license was that it wasn't just the Battlefront series which suffered. Single-player Star Wars was also dead until EA gave up on Battlefront, in which then we finally got to see something good drip-fed to us. Even then, it's only now that the exclusivity deal is over that we're finally seeing new games getting released. Even classic games from the PS2 and 360 era are being re-released and ported over. And I was hopeful that it was only a matter of time when we would eventually see the first 2 Battlefront games remade or re-released on consoles. After all, when the best-selling console of this generation can't even play EA's game, so why not? So here we are again, 20 years after it first came out, and from the series' tallest peaks to its lowest valleys, we're right back where we started. Blasting clankers on a PS2 game, which is now on a portable handheld hybrid that can actually go online. Now, if only someone can go out and make a Battlefront 3.